This is a series of videos that's talking about different terminology people use in the space of healing from religion. And this is a big one. It's the term religious trauma. Many people have different definitions for what this is. Feel free to research and see what other people have to say and come up with what works for you. The first caveat I want to say is that in general, when people use the word trauma, they're talking about an event, something that happened to them, like the trauma of my car wreck. They're saying that thing that was trauma. And sometimes that's how they're using the word religious trauma. And that is a completely valid way to use that term. Religious trauma sometimes is the actual thing that happened to you when something harmful happened to you in religion. However, it might be helpful to understand that in the psychology field, that's not really how trauma is usually being referenced. So in psychology, we're pulling off of the work and the research from things like understanding PTSD, basically in the 1980s, where they were starting to understand people coming home from things like war, and the war's over, they're home, but they have a whole entire set of symptoms that is because of what they experienced, back then in that event. And so trauma is what has happened inside of you and what has happened to you as a result of the things that happened in that one situation or in that chronic situation. Also on that note is originally there was just PTSD, which was like a single event, like an earthquake, or maybe you experienced war. But Judith Herman is a researcher who understood that there was something called complex PTSD, which is when a series of events or a chronic exposure to something happens over a long amount of time. With religious trauma, because people sometimes are exposed to the harmful elements from birth and maybe all throughout childhood and maybe for decades after that. And so those symptoms look more like CPTSD. But just in general, when we're talking about what trauma is in the psychology field, we're talking about a couple of things. How that event changes your way of thinking. Another element of trauma is your emotions. So depression, anxiety, high waves of anger, high waves of grief. The intensity of emotions are also an element of trauma, as well as how it changes your interpersonal relationships. So people with religious trauma oftentimes have difficulty trusting other people, trusting, social dynamics, especially if they were hurt in a context of social dynamics, which is often true with religion. And then finally, the last element of trauma that I would pinpoint is physiological. Our understanding of the physiological element of trauma in the psychology field has really escalated in the last 10 years, because now we're understanding that when someone has trauma, they may carry it in their nervous system. So let me read you the definition that I have written down for religious trauma. In psychology, we think of trauma as a psychological impact of a harmful experience. There's cause and effect. Something happened to you, either a single event or more frequently in religion, a chronic exposure. Religious trauma is the resulting impact to your thinking, emotions, relationships, and even your physical body. And while every person is unique in the ways that religious trauma impacts their psychology, there are some common symptoms. So in another video, I will unpack a little bit more what are some of the symptoms. If this is something that applies to you, if you are here listening to this because you feel like you need to heal from religion or you've had a harmful experience in religious context, I am so sorry. This is not just about terminology or learning. This is something real that happened that harms you, and it harms a lot of people, and you are not alone. And also, I hope you hear me say that even though these things are real, it is possible to experience healing from them. And there are other people who are also on that same journey. And so you are not alone in what you are encountering. And you're also not alone in the journey of healing.